Hi, I'm Leanpub from Leanpub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Daniel Vacanti. Based in the Miami-Fort Lauderdale area, Dan is co-author of the Kanban Guide, co-founder of prokanban.org, and co-founder of Actionable Agile, where they provide world-class software training and consulting to help businesses improve their flow and achieve predictable product delivery. You can follow him on Twitter at Dan Vacanti and check out his websites at prokanban.org and actionableagile.com. Along with his colleague Pratik Singh, Dan is also co-host of the Drunk Agile podcast, which you can find on YouTube and wherever else you find podcasts. I can say from experience that it's a really fun podcast to listen to, just really great conversations. Dan is the author of the Leanpub book, Actionable Agile Metrics, Volume 2, Advanced Topics in Predictability. In the book, Dan provides a comprehensive guide on how to use flow metrics and analytics to get the predictability your customers crave, and really goes into a lot of detail at an advanced level based on his previous books. In this interview, we're going to talk about what Dan's been up to since he was last on the podcast just over a little bit a year ago, and about his brand new book. So thank you very much, Dan, for being on the Front Matter podcast.
I was going to say, long time listener, first time caller. I enjoy the show, but you know I've been on this a couple of times. So thanks so much for having me. Really glad to be back. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, it's really great. What have you been up to in the last year?
Writing a book. from one. Yeah. But mostly, I mean, the things that you just mentioned, trying to get the prokanban.org community, off the ground. That's been certainly a learning experience and an exciting one, I think, for any followers of what we're trying to do with Kanban and flow principles in general. But between my work on Actionable Agile software, and writing a book, I don't know. I think that fills up a year, I think, pretty quickly. Yeah.
Yeah. And have you been doing work on a course or courses as well?
I did do, for the first book, I did do a video course, and released it on a couple of platforms. Let's not talk about how well that has or has not performed or whatever, but yes, I mean, there is if people are interested, please let me know, because it is out there if anybody's, if you want to learn a little bit more about the metrics themselves.
Oh, fantastic. So why don't we dive into talking about your new book, which is, Advanced Topics in Predictability. So for anyone interested in sort of getting up to the advanced level, the two previous books are Actionable Agile Metrics for Predictability and When Will It Be Done? And I think our last interview was for When It Will Be Done. When Will It Be Done? So if you're looking for a resource, sort of get ready for that book, that's a really good place to start. And so I guess it's the interesting place to start, I guess, is with the story of Wilt Chamberlain and his sort of best individual performance game. And so I was wondering if you could sort of set the stage by talking about what happened in that game.
Yeah, so I was actually the gentleman that you had on earlier, Pratik Singh, who we were talking about before, clued me into a podcast by Malcolm Gladwell. And I'm not a huge Malcolm Gladwell fan. Not that he's bad, but I don't know, just he's never done anything for me. Where Malcolm Gladwell talked about this particular game, Wilt Chamberlain, where if anybody's not familiar, Wilt Chamberlain's the only person in NBA history to score 100 points in a single game. It's never been done before. It hasn't been done since. Nobody's really technically come close. And so I listened to this podcast, and Malcolm Gladwell came to all of these conclusions. I was like, I'm not quite sure that's right. And I didn't know much. I didn't know any better, but it just didn't sound right when I was listening to it. So I went and I did a whole bunch of research about what happened that night and that whole season, as a matter of fact. Found a really obscure NBA website with a bunch of statistics, that I was able to download and do some analysis, and it was that study was a nice way for me to kind of set the stage for, there's a lot of stuff that's kind of hidden in data, kind of almost purposefully hidden in data. That's just really kind of the nature of data, that you have to be really, really careful how you tease some of this stuff out, because you might come to the wrong conclusions, as Gladwell did, as I think Gladwell did, if you're not careful. Yeah. So I don't know if that's where you wanted to go.
Yeah, no, that's exactly where I wanted to go. I'm definitely not in the, not to, pick on a famous person. I'm definitely not a fan of Malcolm Gladwell's. I find that he kind of does make mistakes and kind of makes conclusions that seem a lot more certain than they ought to be. It's a great way to sell books, so good for him.
Yeah. I mean, I could learn a few things from Malcolm Gladwell, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly. But like the phenomenon of actually like not to go specifically of his fame sort of speaks to the kind of desire that people have for, I think, easy answers, which is again is easy thing to say, a hard thing to sort of say what you were like. What do you mean then? Then what would you actually do? But you actually do this in the book, and so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that story. So like I think part of the distraction that one can have when like sort of looking at this kind of outlier, to use a loaded word in the conversation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But like there's this outlier game, and one of the things Wilt Chamberlain had done was switched to underhand free throws.
Right. And that was the whole premise behind the podcast, was that it was that switch, the switch from shooting overhand free throws to shooting underhand free throws, that's what allowed Wilt to achieve that point score. What was interesting is if you go do some research and you go look at the data, you'll see that Wilt Chamberlain had been shooting underhand free throws pretty much that whole season. And not only did he have one of the best shooting performances, which is the one that Malcolm Gladwell called out, but he also had one of the worst shooting performances, not only of that season, but of his whole career. And that worst shooting performance happened just 4 games before the best one. And so that's the thing, it's like, you can't really just look at, I love that you use the word outlier. You can't really just look at this one data point and assume that there's signal there. This is really kind of the whole point of the book, and assume that there's signal there without looking at the context of the whole data set and the whole conditions under which that data was collected, because it might just be noise, in which I don't want to go too much of a spoiler because I want you all to buy the book, but but that's really kind of the premise, is when you're looking at data, what's really signal, what's really noise.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things I like about the premise of the book is that even if you're like kind of getting to an advanced level, this can still be, now you're ready to really understand these things, but you do have to build a bit of a foundation in advance. And starting with an example from sports sports sort of data, which is something most of us are familiar with, and the way people can get kind of obsessed with it. I just wanted to start there, but like what we're really talking about is basically like industrial processes and people watching the quality of like ball bearings being produced and things like that, which is like incredibly serious if you've ever been in a moving vehicle. For example, you want this sort of uniformity to be tracked somehow, and you want the people who are looking at it not to be distracted by sort of noise that's actually a signal, and signal that's actually a noise, and things like that. And so just to get going on that note, to give people a bit of a sense of like how technical these things can get, but how kind of there is a solution at the end of it. What's variability in data analysis or in data?
Yeah. So the idea is whenever you're collecting data, especially some type of measurement, like measuring how well we shoot free throws, measuring the width of ball bearings, whenever there's some type of data collection, and like I said, in the book, I really do focus on measurements. There's always going to be changes from one quantity to the next, right? I mean, you will never ever, I should say never ever, I can say that confidently, when you're making measurements, not only won't you, it shouldn't even be your expectation that every time you measure something, you're going to get the exact same answer every time. That's just not reasonable. That's just not how the world works. And so variation then is, well, what are those changes from one measurement to the next, or from one data point to the next? What are those small changes? And the question becomes, well, if we have to expect changes, then the real question that we want to answer is, well, how much change is too much change? At what point does a change signal, some fundamental shift in our process, or something like that? And so that's what variability is, and that's what the study of variability aims to go, is to, like I said, to be able to separate out that signal from noise. 99% of the time, you're dealing with noise, right? And you should not be responding to those little shifts. Imagine, I think I mentioned this in the book. Imagine if every time, one night Wilt shoots 87%, and then the very next night he shoots 50%. Well, does that mean he's gotten worse? Well, no, that's to be expected. It's like, so.
And yet the mysteries of data and people's engagement with it, and I mean, there's so many experiences that I think we've all had. Like if you've ever been in like kind of, I don't think I really have, but like if you've ever been in a job with a manager whose job is to measure you, And, they come to your desk and they're like, last week you did this many tasks and this week you did this many tasks. What happened? And it's like the one answer is there's going to be variability. But there's an example you give in your book of like where there's just like all these red flags and they're like, oh yeah, there's red flags. That's just variability.
Yeah. That's the other thing, right?
And it's like, well, but that's one of the things where like sort of like you need to have these sophisticated analyses, like, Monte Carlo simulation and stuff like that you need to like really have an understanding of those things and to get over the idea that your intuition or your kind of folk science, is good enough for managing people and processes.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that does, and not to pick on any particular Agile framework or anything like that, but that happens a lot where a team will be measuring itself and they'll be like, well, yeah, last time we did this many things and this time we only did this many things. Something's wrong. Well, no, or look, we got better. Well, no, that's not necessarily true either. So you're right. It's getting to a level of comfort to recognize that variation, it's not only to be expected, it's intrinsic. I mean, you just can't escape it. So you really have to get comfortable with that. And the second you get comfortable with that, that's what's going to open your eyes to some of these other statistical techniques, like you're talking about. If we start talking about probabilistic forecasting and things like that, like Monte Carlo simulation, and why those types of things are so important, so that we can model the variability that we are going to experience and talk about from a forecasting perspective. If we can expect this much variability, well, what in terms of risk management, what should we be planning toward? So I said a lot there without really saying too much.
No, I think you did. And the one thing you're reminding me of is it's very interesting is the notion from, this is maybe a bit of a tangent, but notion from theoretical physics where like we've got a model of how things work, but when we look at them, it sort of collapses them down into a sort of definite state. But
exactly.
The act of looking actually does have an impact on the system itself. And so I just bring that up as a kind of fun analogy for something very serious, which is that, to come up with a series of data, I have to be looking at the process, which to some extent means interfering in it just directly, right?
Absolutely. And that's where the danger creeps in, because that's where you get those management people coming in and saying, well, you did this much last week, why can't you do this much this week? I mean, that's, if we start reading Deming would start calling things like that, tampering, taking action when action isn't warranted. Well, when the data doesn't suggest that we really, that's really going to make things worse in the long run. Like I said, going back to the Wilt example, if he shoots 87% one night and then 50% the next night, is it going to completely change the shooting technique because of that? And imagine if every night he shot differently, he changed his shooting technique. Well, after a while, he'd just be a mess, right? And so that's really, but yet that's, I think, as Agile practitioners, a lot of times we're actually taught that, we're taught that, hey, if this sprint is different than the last sprint, well, okay, we got to look at that, and we got to talk about what we need to change in our process to make sure that we're getting better.
Yeah, it's one thing I wanted to talk about, because I was sort of curious learning about it from your book, and just to give people a sense of what the advanced part of volume 2 is you talk about, there's PBC, which is process behavior charts, and there's XMR charts. And people should read the book to sort of learn about this, and you really should, right? You shouldn't just go off what you hear on some podcast and go, now I understand that, which is true of all things. But I'm just looking at an example here. That it's from chapter 7, XMR charts and the 4 basics of flow. And so there's 2 charts, one on top, one on bottom, typically for these XMR charts. And I was wondering if you could just give maybe a little bit of an explanation. Imagine I knew absolutely nothing about what these were. What's the top chart and what's the bottom chart, and what are they telling me?
Right. So the XMR chart is a special case of a PBC. So just to get our terminology right for the listeners,
Yeah.
We have this kind of generic term that's called process behavior chart. A specific instance of a specific instance, not the, is called an XMR chart. And it's called an XMR chart because it's actually 2 charts. It's an X chart and it's an MR chart. So that's kind of what you're getting at. The X chart is the top chart. And I think I don't know this for sure. It's just something I guess I've assumed, but I think the reason it's called an X chart is because you kind of think of it, it's what you're really doing is you're plotting a random variable, essentially. Remember I said, if we're doing this data collection, any flow metric specifically is a random variable, and so that's kind of why it's called an X chart, because you're just plotting every instance of a new data value you get. You're just plotting that in what's called a run chart, so which is a time sequence ordered plot of the data values, right? That's really, and so from that, there's some certain calculations. Again, you have to read the book to figure out what these calculations are, but there's some certain calculations that we can do on that X chart to draw boundaries around what's reasonable variability, what's to be expected, and what's exceptional variability, what's not normal, what potentially represents signal. That's the purpose of the X chart. The problem with the X chart, if there is a problem with the X chart, there really isn't, is that not all signal can necessarily be detected that way. Further, I don't want to get way too technical here. Further, one of the ways that you're detecting, one of the elements of the calculation, I guess I should say, in terms of how much variability is too much variability, is this idea of tracking the moving range, which is where the MR comes from. So you're taking the each successive difference. So each time a new dot comes in, you're measuring the difference between the previous dot. That's called a moving range, and you plot those moving ranges on the bottom chart. Like I said, for two reasons. Number one, because that's yet another way to potentially detect signal is, if those moving ranges get too wide. But then number two, it's kind of a sanity check. Because the moving range is how we're calculating variability, we can take a look at the moving range chart and make sure that our limits are drawn properly on our X chart. So if anybody ever shows you an X chart without the corresponding moving range, it's potentially suspect, because you don't know truly what that variability is unless you see the moving ranges.
And so
I waved my hands a lot there. Is this going to be a video?
We're publishing video now. So there will be some video, but I use my hands all the time too. But just to draw on my own personal experience. So for example, if I'm looking at if I'm plotting let's say the share price, one exercise that people will do is they'll have one chart that's just a change in the daily change in the share end of day share price.
Exactly.
And then what you might do, so that would be the top chart, and then the bottom chart would be, what's the average change in the last 5 days? Is that the kind of thing that's being shown in the moving range chart? I got the feeling it wasn't quite that.
Well, it's close. You could technically see that from a moving range chart, but really in the bottom chart, what you're seeing is, so let's say that one day the share price is 50, the next day the share price is 52. Well, the difference in those two values is 2. So we plot that 2 on the MR chart. Then the next day, the closing price was 32. And so the difference in 52 to 32 is 20. So we plot that on that 20 on the moving range.
I got it. So the top one is, you're seeing the absolute values within the boundaries of the total data thing. Okay. And when we're talking about boundaries here, we're talking about upper boundaries and lower boundaries. And the example you give in the book is like, if you were rolling dice, the top boundary would be 6, the bottom would be 1. You're never going to see a 7 or a 0. That's an analogy to kind of how you actually do most data analysis, but it's along those lines. So you're actually seeing things within this variation.
Exactly. Yeah, because we know in the dice example, dice is a great example, I think, because if you ever see a 7 or you see a 0, it's a pretty good indication there's something wrong, right? If you're rolling a 6-sided die and you see a 7, there's probably something wrong there, and that's exactly what we're looking for in our data analysis.
One, since this book is sort of meant for people who are sort of want to learn this, and it might be for people who want to bring these kinds of analysis into their organization or sort of change the way people do things in their organization. One really interesting point you make in the book is that, like, although shooting underhand free throws might be a superior technique objectively and with all the analysis there might be just incredible cultural pressure that makes it basically impossible for people to adopt it. So even though it's better, people won't do it. And a famous example would be, in the last few years, the sort of 3-point shot has become much more popular in basketball because there was just a kind of, someone just sort of went and said, hey, why don't we just like do genius, but like, why don't we just do 3-point shots more and see if that helps us score more points and win more games? It turns out it does. But in the past, like the dunk was like the height of scoring, right? Because it's exciting. But like, and I'm sort of like circling around, but the idea of like sports where like reputations and fame and billions of dollars are at stake, and yet still, if you've ever seen the movie Moneyball, the idea of like just using computers was like, why would we do that? It's not in our culture. And then it's not kind of like manly enough to do that kind of analysis. And I just find it endlessly fascinating the way at the very same moment that people put on sort of the affect that they're being no nonsense, they're completely full of shit. And so what can you do if you're like sort of trying to introduce a kind of analysis into an organization where it's just culturally like not just not done, but like shunned?
Yeah. I mean, if I can, because a similar great trend is in the NFL now with more teams going for it on fourth down. We've known for years, if not decades, that data supported, going up on fourth down more often, than not. And it's only really been in the past couple of years that teams have really embraced that, because you're right, it was kind of culturally shunned. This is not, you play it safe. If it's fourth down, you punt it and you go for field position and things like that, because that's what wins you games. And no one ever got fired. No coach ever got fired for punting on fourth down. Well, it turns out, as you're pointing out, a lot of times you're taking much more risk by punting. You feel like you're not taking more risk. You feel like you're playing it safe, but you're actually taking more risk because you're endangering your ability to score. You're endangering your ability to, to keep your defense off the field. You're endangering, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, it's a good question that you pose. And maybe the reason I'm waffling a bit is because I don't know that I have a good answer, but I think this data is a good start, but I think like the 3-point shot in the NBA or going for fourth on fourth down, it's like, it's hard to argue with success, so it's like, I think once you see it, even though the data may have supported it for years, once people, acknowledge that it can be successful, that's probably the tipping point. We're just going to use all of Gladwell's titles here.
Don't blink, there'll be another Malcolm Gladwell reference. But that's really, that's a very practical point that you made at the end, though. There were like, if you're listening to this and you're thinking of trying to introduce these kinds of things into your organization or your consulting work or something like that, it's the oldest MBA thing in the book. Have a case study to show how it increased revenue. If you can, I say this not as like just having interviewed lots of experts and this kind of thing, not being one myself, but like, if you can show how it's going to move the bottom line, that's no guarantee it's going to work. But if you start with that as your pitch, like this will improve the bottom line, like at the very least, people are going to sit up in their seats and pay attention.
Right. Well, and this is where I always fall on Deming too. Deming had some great sayings about this. One of his most famous is, "In God we trust, all others bring data." And then without data, you're just I don't think he said this, but there's another, without data, you're just another asshole with an opinion, and and things like that. So even before the success, for me, I think you have to collect that data. You have to have some type of insight.
And to plug the book, though, you also have to know what to do with that data, right? To draw, a little bit on my own experience. I ran a hockey stats website for a while because I was just infuriated that, like, when I look at like the standings for the NHL, it's like I'm a 19th century businessman with a newspaper and I see a table of rows and columns. And it's like, but if you've been in the investment in stock world, it's kind of like, oh, we've got Bloomberg terminals with charts now, and that's a very dated reference, but like, we've got charts that can show performance over time. Why don't we have something like that showing that for a team's performance over a season? And like anything would be good, like just win, loss, like I call it a heartbeat chart, something like that. But then, so like, trying to fit in these, like the number of games played aren't the same because you're going on the date, like the chart, the table is showing you the date. So that the games played is different. And, the kind of like, then they do these clunky things where it's last 5, win-loss tie, last 10 win-loss ties, stuff like that. Yeah. All of these things easily represented in charts. But for some reason, convention just, means that you don't look at those kinds of things. And then in that particular case with sports, I think like a lot of the sports exist as basically a kind of soap opera, largely for people. They love the sort of moment to moment, big reveal, oh, it's actually, there's what's the sports version of like, it's an identical twin, like kind of stuff. And people love that. They actually love the day to day. And I just find that sort of like one of the reasons sports is such a good analysis for business process stuff is that like the day to day soap opera actually is what's sort of more important to some people than the like kind of like boring kind of pencil behind the ear, green eye shade kind of work you need to do.
Yeah, maybe you're pointing out why my books maybe don't sell as well as they should, because what I am promoting is being boring, right? If your day to day is drama like what you're talking about, then you're almost certainly not predictable. I'm a big proponent of making your process as boring as possible, because if it's boring, it's probably predictable. But yeah. Maybe I need to change my approach. Thanks, Len. Thanks for that.
It's just an observation I've had that like, often again, it's sort of like that sort of weird contrast that at the very moment that people are putting on the affect that they're very serious, it's actually kind of entertainment that really they're engaging in.
For sure.
But I definitely, jokes aside, this is a very good book that Dan's been working on for a long time. And it does build on the work of his previous 2 books. And it's there's interesting sports analogy in there, but like there's lots of very serious stuff, and it's a really good way to learn about these techniques. In the last part of the interview, as you know, we like to talk about the person's experience writing and stuff like that. So, and there are people who skip to the end if they find a way to do so to learn about that. So, how did you go about writing this book? Did you set aside a block of time every day? I'm going to get up in my first hour in the morning, I'm going to write. Did you tell your family you're not going to be seeing me on the weekends, kind of thing? How did that work?
This book was actually kind of a happy accident. Because it's been almost 10 years since I published my first book, the volume 1 of this book. And I actually sat down to try and maybe come out with a second edition of that because, horror of horrors, there is maybe some outdated stuff or certainly some things that maybe need to be touched up in that book. So I sat down and when I was revisiting my notes from that first book, I realized there was a whole bunch of stuff that didn't make the cut, right? Was left on the editing room floor. And I was like, okay, well, maybe the first thing I'll do to kind of ease my way into this, maybe the first thing I'll do is just create a blog series on all this stuff that didn't make the cut for the first book. And as I was doing that, I realized I've got easily enough material for another book. And the book is really a tale of 2 halves. I mean, the 2 halves kind of play well together, but really there's the first section and then there's a second section. And it is a bit jarring the way that the book moves from, I know I'm doing a good job of selling the book here, moving from section 1 to section 2. But that's really more due to the fact that there was kind of all these leftover pieces that I was trying to make a cohesive whole. So that was really kind of the inspiration of the book. And then because I already had all this stuff, it was really just a matter of editing it. So whenever, or polishing it or augmenting. So it's really just whenever I had time, on any given day. I tried to generally set myself a goal of doing some writing most days, whether that's 500 words, 1,000 words, whatever. Right. A good day for me is like 3,000 words, just as kind of a rough heuristic. But that was I just tried to set a goal for myself. And you do that, and pretty soon, within a month or so, you've got a book,
That's really great. Yeah, no, that's interesting. Some people do the kind of time block, and other people do the words, the number of words kind of target. I'm definitely actually in the latter camp myself. It's kind of set yourself a number of words to write, and if you get it done in half an hour, great. Go get a drink or something like that. And if it takes you 6 hours, you're like, well, I've just really got to grind it out. And it's really good for motivation and sort of sense of productivity and stuff like that as well. Which when you're writing a book is very important. Like trying to maintain a good mood, if you can, about what you're doing. And like, although these targets seem arbitrary, and they kind of are, having them and meeting them every day or every week or what have you is a really important part of like, feeling like you're making progress and getting towards it. And there was one more question I wanted to ask you about that. Oh yes, sorry, not question, but observation. That was a very good description you gave of, and I'd never really quite thought of it before, but whenever you're writing a book, there's a lot of stuff that ends up on the cutting room floor. And actually kind of like you just reminded me, keeping a folder of cuts would actually be a really interesting thing to do. And I'm sure there's other authors who do that, but like, my cuts always end up in sort of just kind of left in a previous version or something, like previous numbered version, but not separated out into a place of cuts. And that would be a really interesting thing, even just for the book itself that you're writing, but for any kind of subsequent blog, if you're writing a nonfiction book, any subsequent blog posts or something like that, there's definitely value to be had in that. And in your case, like it's a whole new book, which is great. Dan, thank you very much for being on the podcast again. And thank you very much for using Leanpub as one of the platforms for getting your work out there. We really appreciate it.
Well, thanks very much for having me. Thanks for the hard work that you do at Leanpub. Like I said, if as we were talking about before, if I didn't have an outlet like Leanpub, I don't know that I would have ever taken the author plunge. So I just want to say thanks so much for doing that. And who knows, maybe sometime soon I will be back on with second editions of some of the previous books that I've got. I'd love to be able to come in and talk a little bit more about that. But until then, thank you so much.
Thanks very much.